Hi, this is Sergeant Betsy Brantner Smith with the National Police Association, and this is the NPA report. I have with me today a guest that I have known for a long time. We're not going to tell you how long we've known each other because that'll start to age us. But I'm really excited because he's a guy like me who was running and gunning for decades on a mission, and then he decided to retire, and like me, he failed miserably at retirement, and he's back running and gunning with another pro law enforcement initiative. Craig Floyd, welcome to the program.
Great to be with you, Betsy.
So Craig, we first got to know each other as you're in your role as the CEO for the National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial Fund. And in fact, when we first met, we brought our youngest daughter to Washington, D.C. to see the National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial, what we always call our wall. Will you talk about the wall and talk about how that all happened and what your involvement was?
Well, it all goes back to a chance meeting I had with a congressman by the name of Mario Biaggi. He was a highly decorated, in fact, the most decorated cop in New York City history when he retired from the department in 1963. And he went on to have a 20-year career in Congress. And for the last 10 years of those 20 years, I was privileged to be his legislative assistant. And one of the projects, being a former cop, obviously all the law enforcement folks came to our office when they needed help. And one of the projects that he was asked to lead was to build a National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial, a monument in Washington, D.C. that would pay tribute to the fallen, but also to all law enforcement officers in America. And it was truly a privilege of mine to be able to lead that project. He more or less turned the project over to me once the legislation became law and said, Craig, make sure that monument gets built. And I went over and became a full-time executive director of the Memorial Fund it would have been 1988 when I took it on full-time, but it was authorized by Congress in 1984, a memorial to be built in Washington, D.C. on federal parkland to honor America's law enforcement professionals. So 84, it was dedicated in 1991, took us 7 years to get the job done. And on that day, President George H.W. Bush dedicated the national monument. His wife, Barbara, was with him. 25,000 people attended that dedication ceremony. And at that time, this kind of puts things in some perspective. There were about 12,500 names on the memorial. It was less than half filled. But since that time, we now have 22,611 names inscribed on the memorial walls. A lot of officers have made the ultimate sacrifice, and now their names are on that wall permanently. They will always be honored. They will always be remembered. And sadly, we have to add hundreds of new names each and every year. And so that's why the wall is now almost full. And that's why this past year, there's been an effort to expand the memorial walls because we had run out of room. And so that's what I did for those first early years. And then we took a hiatus where we focused on the memorial, on ceremonies. We built a small visitor center in Washington, D.C. And then we decided to take on another initiative, and that was to build the National Law Enforcement Museum right across the street from the memorial so that we could tell the stories behind the names on the memorial walls and really the entire story of American law enforcement. It's a wonderful story, inspirational really, of service and sacrifice. So much underappreciated and unknown to many. And that's why we wanted to make sure that museum got built. And today it stands proudly in Washington, D.C. among the many other museums and memorials that we have in our nation's capital.
And I would encourage people, I'll tell you, I will never forget, because I was a brand new police sergeant when the wall got dedicated. And then it took 4 or 5 years, I think, before I was able to go visit it. And it is so beautiful. It's imposing. when you see the sheer number of names on that wall. And I don't know if everybody recognizes the importance of that wall to the profession of American law enforcement. You know, every cop who goes to that wall finds the name of somebody that they knew, somebody they were related to, somebody that they worked with, and to touch those names, to see those names. It's an indescribable experience for people, isn't it?
Well, it's exceeded, I think, my own expectations in terms of the impact it would have on law enforcement officers and on the families of the fallen. We certainly knew that it was going to be important, but to your point, it's exceeded even my wildest expectations about its importance to every law enforcement officer in America, and certainly to the families of the fallen. I remember one incident in particular. Paul Harvey, who was a very famous radio broadcaster for many, many decades. And he was our keynote speaker at our first candlelight vigil after the memorial was dedicated, because his father had died in the line of duty as a Tulsa police detective. This was more than 70 years earlier. I picked up Paul Harvey at the airport, took him to the memorial as soon as we got there. We walked the memorial wall. He became impatient. He's like, "Craig, where is my father's name?" And we had arrived at the panel where his father's name was inscribed. He touched the wall, and frankly, he broke down. He sobbed, tears that as if his father had died yesterday, but his father had died more than 70 years earlier. But that's what impact it had on Paul Harvey 7 decades after his father's death. And I think we see that each and every day at the memorial when family, loved ones, friends, colleagues visit that wall and see that name.
Craig, you have worked most of your life, your adult life, in the belly of the beast, Washington, D.C. And you've done so much good. And now we see policing becoming so political. And I'll tell you, when I started in 1980 as a police officer, I didn't know the politics of anyone I worked with. We were told very simply in the academy, you don't talk about politics. And frankly, in as a kid at home, we were told the same thing. You don't talk politics, you don't talk religion with people, with people that you don't know well. And it wasn't a political thing. Now it's become so political. Why do you think that is?
Well, I've experienced the same thing here in my own neighborhood where I live. I'm surrounded by several homes that have Black Lives Matter signs in their yard, which I have no problem with. But I feel like if I had put a Blue Lives Matter sign out there, it would be as if I hate Blacks. And by putting a Black Lives Matter sign in their yard, it's almost like they hate police. And I don't think that's the case at all. But unfortunately, that's the impression that so many people have because of this divisive nature. The fact is this, as you know better than I, Betsy, law enforcement officers are great friends of all, especially in the minority communities, the disadvantaged communities that have many Blacks, many Hispanics, and they love the fact that police are keeping their communities safe. And law enforcement officers want to do nothing but help those people in need, those people that are being preyed upon by violent criminals. And we should embrace law enforcement. I always say that I've had the privilege that most Americans don't have. I'm not a law enforcement officer, never have worn the badge, but I've had the privilege of meeting thousands of officers during the last 4 decades. And I know what's in their heart. I know what they do to keep America safe, the sacrifices they make. There was a great story that I remember from a radio show I used to host. And I interviewed a surviving spouse of an officer who had died in the line of duty. And I asked her, I said, "What do you remember about the funeral for your husband?" And she said, "Craig, I was in a fog that day, really. But I remember one moment in particular. A homeless man walked up to her and said, 'You don't know me, but I'm here to pay my respects to your husband, because every night before he would go home to you and your kids, he would stop to check on me. He would make sure I had a blanket during the winter. I had food to eat. Occasionally, he'd give me money so I could go out and buy some food and take care of myself. And the woman said to me, Craig, the most amazing thing about that story, my husband never once mentioned that homeless man or told me what he did every night before he came home to me and my family. And I think that speaks so highly and so powerful about what officers do when nobody's looking. I mean, these are the types of stories that go on each and every day in an officer's life. They don't even bring it home oftentimes because they want to compartmentalize, their job and their family. I get that. But so many of the cameras never focus on the good that officers do. But that story to me is very typical of what is in the heart of law enforcement officers across this country.
Absolutely. So Craig, fast forward to a little bit into your retirement, when you did retire from the National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial, you decided to get back involved with a new organization and a new mission. Talk about that.
Well, like you, Betsy, I thought I was going to enjoy a very peaceful, enjoyable retirement. I did retire at the end of 2018. We had just completed a 20-year mission, which was to build the National Law Enforcement Museum, which was dedicated in October of 2018. I retired a few months later. I wanted to make sure we got that museum built before I left. And I'm here in Alexandria, Virginia with my family. I'm playing golf. I have a place at the beach. I was enjoying life, selling baseball cards, writing a book about my experience. And I was very happy with all of that. But then May of 2020 happened. And if you remember, as most people do in law enforcement, that's when George Floyd died. And that's when things changed dramatically in this country of ours, especially with regard to the media and others who were protesting against law enforcement and calling them brutal racists. And I knew law enforcement better than just about any citizen in this country, certainly better than any media person. And I was appalled at how law enforcement was being treated, at the hatred that was being spewed toward them. Knowing what they've done for this country of ours, knowing that there are more than 22,000 names of officers who have sacrificed their lives for public safety. And they were being dishonored by the fact that there were more than 10,000 anti-police protests in this country since George Floyd's death. Thousands of protesters arrested. The media amplifying those voices of hatred toward law enforcement in a very complicit way. And I couldn't stand on the sidelines any longer, knowing what I knew and knowing what I had devoted my life to over the last 40 years. I had to come and become a voice in support of law enforcement, a voice of the citizenry of this country. And so I started this organization called Citizens Behind the Badge. It's a 501c4, an advocacy group that basically is designed to stop this outrageous and despicable defund the police movement, which has caused a public safety crisis in this country. As we all know, crime is soaring. Law enforcement officers are leaving the profession in droves, and we have a real problem on our hands. It's probably not going to be solved for the next several years. This has set this country back dramatically. And I wanted to make sure we stop the defund movement, that we stop the soft on crime policies that it's created, and that law enforcement got the respect and support that they needed and deserved to keep America safe. And I'm pleased to say that there are tens of thousands of Americans who have joined us as supporters of Citizens Behind the Badge, because they wanted to do something to show their support for law enforcement and to show their anger and frustration over the defund movement and the soft on crime policies that have resulted.
Craig, and that's the thing, a lot, in the last, 21 months or so, normal citizens who want to say that they support law enforcement, that want to say they back the blue, that want to fly that thin blue line flag, like the one that is behind me, they are attacked, aren't they? And they are called racist and they are called all kinds of names. And it's because of the false narrative, the vilification of law enforcement. And how do we combat that false narrative that somehow law enforcement is the problem? Because the statistics, facts are facts. American law enforcement, we end up fatally shooting around 1,000 people a year, depending on the year. The 99.9% of those are people who were attacking us. Most were armed, and again, these aren't facts that are hidden. These are easy to locate facts. And yet when you talk to people, and I'm sure you find the same thing, I'll ask an average, person that I meet at a party or whatever, how many people do you think, American law enforcement, ends up killing, every day? And they're like, oh, they must kill like 100 people a day, right? I mean, it's just, there's this bizarre false narrative out there. How do we combat that?
Well, we combat it, Betsy, with the truth. And that's really what Citizens Behind the Badge is all about. That's what I've been proudest of during the last 2 years that I've had this project underway, is I've scoured newspapers, reports, government findings, you name it. And I always source my facts. And I put it on a website. And every day I'm putting it out on social media. I'm trying to let people know what the truths are about law enforcement. When it comes to police and use of force, for example, there are roughly 60 million interactions every year between police and the citizenry, traffic stops, arrests, you name it. But of those 60 million interactions, force by law enforcement is either threatened or used less than 2% of the time. It hardly ever occurs. When there was a survey of all the people that had an interaction with law enforcement in the last year, they found that fewer than 1% ever had a gun pointed at them by that police officer. They're not using the type of force that the media would have you believe each and every day. In fact, there was a great survey that was done by Pew, and they found that 73% of the officers in this country had never fired their weapon in the line of duty. And frankly, they never will. That's very typical of all the cops I talk to. I always ask them the question, have you ever fired your weapon in the line of duty? And the vast majority will tell you no, never. And that's because law enforcement is not going around shooting people as you'd expect based on the media reports. So I try to get that truth out there. When it comes to police and race, there's a great statistic that's found that of all the adult, and that's age 16 and above, all the adult whites have had a police interaction that was initiated by the police. That's a traffic stop or a street stop. 12% of adult whites have had that type of police interaction, 11% of adult Blacks, and 10% of adult Hispanics. There is no statistical difference between who is being stopped and has any interaction with a law enforcement officer that's initiated by that police person. So we've got to keep those kind of statistics in mind. We've got to put them out there because the media would not report on that. They will tell you every unarmed Black that's been shot and killed by a law enforcement officer. And in 2020, I think that number was 16. And the number of unarmed whites that were shot and killed by police that same year, 26. So you see, you never hear about the unarmed whites that are shot and killed by police, but you certainly hear about the unarmed Blacks. And I think the media has painted a biased picture, a sensationalized picture of law enforcement officers targeting Blacks in this country and being brutal racists. And the numbers just don't back that up at all.
Well, and also what we're seeing is police officers' families are being attacked because of either something that their officer family member has done, been involved in a shooting. Famously, in the summer of 2020, we had an Atlanta police officer who was involved in a shooting. His stepmother got fired from her job simply for being his stepmother. Craig, where can people go to find out more about your organization? Where can they find your social media? Where can they find those statistics so that they can share them with all of their friends and neighbors?
Well, I hope all our viewers and listeners go to www.behindbadge.org. Behindbadge.org will get you to our Citizens Behind the Badge website. And on there, you'll have different sections. I have a section there honoring fallen heroes, a lot of statistical information, a lot of anecdotal stories about officers who died in the line of duty. But I also have a section there called Facts and Figures. And that is where you go for the truths about law enforcement in this country. That's where you'll find the statistics and the facts that I just mentioned, but many, many others to back it up, as well as anecdotal examples of officers being shot and killed, being attacked by the media, and all the rest. So you can go to behindbadge.org, and then you can sign up to get our regular updates that I send out periodically, so that people can keep up with what's happening in law enforcement and know that as a supporter, their money, their support is going to a very good cause that undoubtedly they support vastly through this country. We found that most Americans, as you pointed out many times, support and highly respect law enforcement officers in their community. And we want those people to go to our website and have that information.
Great, Floyd, I cannot thank you enough for spending time with us today and to share all that you're involved in to help support American law enforcement. And if you would like more information about the National Police Association, you can visit us at nationalpolice.org.
Put the gun down! Put the gun down!
Last year, law enforcement officers were involved in hundreds of thousands of use of force incidents. A use of force incident is when an officer must use nonverbal tactics to gain control of a dangerous situation.
Put the knife on the ground.
In many cases, officers have no choice but to use force when a suspect doesn't comply with a lawful order.
Use of force is always ugly. No one likes it, especially police officers.
Together, we can help de-escalate these dangerous encounters. Help police officers by complying with their lawful orders. Don't attack, attempt to disarm, or flee from an officer.
Use of force is an officer's last option. Most incidents can be avoided by not resisting arrest.
If you feel you've been wrongfully detained by a police officer, then seek a legal solution after the encounter has been resolved.
Let's keep everyone safe. Comply now and complain later.